Hey class, this is your teacher. I'm Mr. Cruz. I'm coming at you with another live video. About 8:45 at night. Put the baby to bed um, and finished kind of all my tasks for class, for school, for you guys, and wanted to shoot this quick video to really just dialogue a bit about the last few chapters of the Scarlet Letter, which you guys should be reading as we discussed in our live classes. Remember that next Monday you guys have tests, and there'll be a study guide that's coming up soon. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the last two chapters in particular, because it's really the climax of the story, and really where the romantic side of Hawthorne really gets shown, I think, the most. Um, and you really see the pinnacle. And when I say the pinnacle, I mean the height of his writing prowess, his ability to write, shown in these last few chapters, which don't often come out in the initial chapters precisely because there's so much things happening, so many moving parts. Um, you don't quite see how these characters are really heading towards an end. And quite literally for Dimsdale, there is an end in the end of the book. Part of um, what Hawthorne wants to highlight is something that occurred earlier in the book, which is that Dimsdale struggled with health issues, and we're kind of left wondering whether his death is really a kind of, you know, um, this sense in which he himself is was so moved by the occasion that literally it sapped all his strength, or whether or not this death that he experienced was a result of prior sicknesses. It's unclear. Um, but what we know is in that Election Day sermon, um, at the end of it, the text says there was a spirit of prophecy that came over Dimsdale, and it came upon him. And um, when it uses that language, a spirit of prophecy, it's really using a very Old Testament language to describe what the Old Testament prophets like Isaiah or Jeremiah, for instance, would have experienced. The spirit of prophecy is God speaking to the people of Israel. Now, based on what we talked about in our live class, I think it it totally fits, right? In the live class, what we referred to is this sense in which God was building a new Jerusalem here in America, and Dimsdale's spirit of prophecy is God speaking to this new Israel, these American settlers, to describe a way of life that has so completely gone the other direction. And we'll talk about what the other direction looks like. But this spirit of prophecy that comes over him, what it means is that there's a coming judgment for this activity. Um, that's what happens in the Old Testament usually. Story of prophecy oftentimes gets taken out of context in many ways and gets put as this like kind of warning, like almost like a Cassandra figure, where Cassandra is given the spirit of prophecy. She can see the future, and so she tells of coming events. So like the prophets are like, hey guys, turn and be forgiven. Um, but in many ways, the people of Israel, similar to Cassandra, don't listen to the prophets. Um, but the prophets don't always just tell the future. They also come and discuss the consequences of sin, coming judgment in which God is coming to judge the people of Israel. To, I'm thinking particularly of the prophecy of God's allowance of Israel to go into exile. And this allowance, I think, is in many ways um, brought on by Israel's propensity to continue to walk away from God consistently and consistently. In fact, the Old Testament doesn't get as much, I think, um, coverage because the New Testament is like really the fulfillment of of the Old Testament in many ways. That's the language that we use. But the Old Testament is really interesting in the sense that not only did the Puritans use this Old Testament language, but in many ways, this this Old Testament language is really serving us to understand what's going on in this Puritan era. And Dimsdale really gets down on the relationship between God and man, this sense of desire, the longing for man to be reunited with God, and God's desire that man would know Him, and um, and man would be known in that, right? Um, but it was very clear right at the beginning of the election sermon that, sorry, I have something in my eye. That's why I keep touching my eye. That there's a sadness in the way that Dimsdale's speaking. It says that there is an undertone of pathos, which is, remember from our discussion of logos, ethos, and pathos. Pathos is this sense of emotion, right? This sense of sadness that's undergone his speech. The natural regret is what the text says. The natural regret of one soon to pass away. When you think about it in those terms, and obviously Hawthorne is foreshadowing this sense in which Dimsdale's going to die, and we know that Dimsdale does die, and so that's coming. But really, think about what it's like for someone who knows that they're going to die, who's in a sense unhinged. Now that has a dual meaning, unhinged. We say someone's unhinged usually when they have nothing to lose. So they say things that are so bombastic, so out there that you don't necessarily think about how crazy it is, like because you have nothing to lose. So you just keep saying stuff and saying stuff. Oh, that guy's unhinged. He's crazy. There's another sense in which unhinged could also be the lessening of restrictions and prohibitions that otherwise would have held you in previous times, but now don't. They don't. They don't restrict you any longer. You can say things freely now, right? And remember this. I think this irony I told you about in the live class, where the settlers, the Puritan settlers, wanted to leave Europe because they believed Europe had become a licentious place that nobody's following the ways of God or the rules and laws of the Creator. And they come here to establish a system of government and a system of rule in which people would be free to follow God in the way that they see fit, but free not in a way that anybody sees fit, free in the way that the Puritan magistrates saw fit. So this creates a kind of prohibition that I think everybody is sort of fighting against in the Puritan settlement. Um, that being said, you see in chapters 23 that Hester is still bearing the burden of the Scarlet Letter, while Dimsdale receives the praise for his election day sermon. It uses this very interesting and I think symbolic word called apotheosis. Okay, so they use the word apotheosized, which is a Greek term that means that one is glorified to a kind of divine level. Okay, it's not really a part of what you would consider like Protestant Christianity, or even in the Roman Catholic Church. There's not really a whole lot of apotheosis that occurs in terms of the liturgy of the Catholic Church. It actually occurs more in the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is I don't want to go too much into church history, but there was a time in the late Middle Ages, I'm sorry, after the Reformation, in which there was a bit of a split between East and West in the Catholic Church, and so the Western Catholic Church becomes the Roman Catholic Church. The Eastern Catholic Church becomes Eastern Orthodox Church. Really, just very similar, but different expressions in many ways. So you see a lot of, you know, it's not a lot of Eastern and Western Catholics very much do communion together, and are participate in life together in many ways. Um, but you don't see this apotheosis in the Catholic Church nor in the Protestant Church. You see it more in Eastern Orthodoxy, precisely because apotheosis is, in a way, it's going to sound a little bit interesting and kind of weird, but in a way, apotheosis is this elevation to a kind of divine status, to to be godlike, not to be God, but to be godlike, to be, we in the Protestant Church we sometimes um, uh, can move in that direction. We talk about glorification, right? Like we, usually there's these ways of salvation. So it's like justification and sanctification, we're being more like Christ, and then glorification. The sense of glorification can be like a kind of apotheosis, but I think those in Eastern Orthodox move in maybe a direction that Protestants wouldn't go. But they use this word in the text to describe the sense in which um, Dimsdale has received, I'm sorry, transformed into this divine status almost, like the sense in which he no longer has to, um, he can come out of hiding. He no longer has to hide the truth about himself and Hester. Um, and I think there's something symbolic about that. I don't want to go too much into the summary of the chapter 23 and chapter 24. I just kind of want to lay out themes. I think there's something really important for that in Hawthorne, because you see later on that Dimmesdale says to Hester that to come here. He asks her to come here. He asks her to bring Pearl. Remember, they're on the scaffold, same place that they were in the very beginning of the novel. And he says, "Come here so that I can take my shame upon me, as it should have been," right? Like to bear the burden that he should have born, like at the very beginning of the novel, in which he chose not to bear because he wanted to protect himself, and because the sense in which the prohibitions of Puritan life have have deluded him, right? His status in society has deluded him into believing that's what really matters. That is that's something that you should really be aspiring to, and aspiring for, is the sense of status in society. And Hawthorne is saying a really, really important thing here, I think, about American society that persists even to today. This sense in which the material pleasures of life, this sense in which who I am in terms of status, how it becomes perceived, oftentimes is more important with what is true, right? True in this capital T truth sense, right? Like what is true about God and what is true about me. If indeed it is true that I've committed this thing, and if it indeed is true that God gives grace to those who come to him with a contrite heart and a humble heart, then should I not walk in this truth? Should I not walk in this beautiful grace that God gives? Or should I hide myself? Right? Like think about Adam and Eve after they've committed their sin in Genesis 3, where um, they clothe themselves with fig leaves, hiding themselves. And God, it says in Genesis 3 that he walks in the cool of the garden. That's the kind of relationship God has with Adam and Eve, and he calls out to Adam. Of course, not in any way, shape, or form should we, as readers, assume that God does not know where Adam is. In fact, it's a kind of ironic question, right? Like God's asking, "Where are you?" Um, and they kind of come out from hiding, but they're no longer in the same sense of freeness and joy that they once were. They're clothed with these fig leaves. they're no longer walking in the sense of freedom they once had. Because of their sin, they feel shame, and because of that, they clothe themselves with these really, I mean, rags. If they would have just come out and sought the Lord in His grace, maybe maybe it would have been forgiven. Maybe God would have turned, or rather, um, given them His own sense of covering, right? Or maybe that sense of shame would have been released from them. I don't know. Um, but I think that's one of the themes of this novel, which is that one has to be true to oneself and true to the people in your community. Um, and we use this in the modern sense, the sense of truth and the sense of being true to oneself as this like, I gotta be who I feel that I am. And maybe I think for a romantic, that sense of feeling might be interesting to think about. But I think Hawthorne's getting at an even deeper sense of the human condition, which is that um, being true to oneself is actually the truth about who I am in relation to you. And there's an ethical component to it, I think, that Dimsdale is really trying to highlight, or rather Hawthorne's trying to highlight, which is that I don't exist by myself. These people that say like, well, it's simply, about who you are. Well, who I am is only in relation to who you are. Who I am is only in relation to my wife or to my child. And once that you remove those things, the sense of self that I once felt, it starts to erode. And Dimsdale, having felt the shame of his sin, is not just sad about the fact that he committed a sin. Oftentimes, I think that we lose sight of that part of the Bible in which we feel as though, oh, well, we're sad we did something wrong. I don't think that's the biggest sense of alienation. The biggest sense of alienation is that we did something wrong and that I have fled from you or from God because of it. And the shame that really I might feel because of sin is the sense of me moving away from the other person instead of going to that person and being true to how they perceive me, and being true also to what I could be, like imagining who I could be in response to this. Like, yeah, I did something wrong, but I can promise you it won't happen again. Or, yeah, I did something wrong, but I can promise you that I'm going to be a different person because I see the wrongness of my action. It's a totally different sense of truth, um, because truth has connected to my own self, this sense of my own self worth. I think in many ways, like if we were to rationalize it on ourselves, we could probably rationalize behaviors in all sorts of ways. But the way I think we only can rationalize behaviors in a real sense is how it affects other people, right? Not just the effect, but how it affects, like AFFECT. So it affects other people, the way in which they feel after we've committed an action, how it helps them, how it in a sense liberates them. Um, I think one way we can see this in the story of Scarlet Letter is the opposite effect occurs with Chillingworth, where you can see really the withering power of hatred, and his own sense of rationalizing this amongst his own subjectivity, his own self. He stays within this sense of disgust for Dimmesdale and the sense of hatred, the sense of vengeance. And this begins to erode him to such an extent that by the end of the novel, that he, after Dimmesdale dies, there's nothing else really to do anymore. This was his life ambition, his goal, which was to continually hate Dimmesdale. It was to enact vengeance, and once he did, or once the truth kind of came out, he withered, literally. His body um, gave up, and he died. But not before at the end of the novel, we read that not before Chillingworth gives Hester and Pearl all that he has, all of his possessions. He leaves it to them, and Pearl becomes an heiress of the estate of Chillingworth, um, and things kind of look up for their family, and you see in which a sense in which the stigma that was once put on that family is now lifted. Actually, Hester wears her Scarlet Letter still, she wears it proudly, and she doesn't see it with the same kind of disdain she once did. She really takes on this persona of what I think the people thought of her beforehand, which was that she is able. She's not just an adulteress. She's able. She's able to overcome something that is incredibly dramatic and incredibly isolating and alienating, and she's able to. She was always able to do the thing that Dimsdale could never do, which is to be true, right? Like I think that's the lesson that we learn from Hester, which is that she can be true. She was true, um, even when it cost her, and it did cost her in a very big way. Dimsdale, on the other hand, was not until the very end. Uh, and in that sense, I think I talked about this in the live class. Up until now, I haven't felt bad for Dimsdale. I haven't really felt. I felt some sympathy because he's sad, but I haven't felt a whole lot of sympathy because he allows Hester to suffer. And by the end, there is a sense in which, I gotta say, like, uh, that scene in which the spirit of prophecy comes over him, and he's able to speak boldly the things concerning his relationship with Hester, and just his relationship with God in this whole process was very moving for me, very moving for um, a variety of reasons. Number one of which is that um, if you've lived long enough, you know what it means to hide, and what it means to hide yourself from other people, and to hide yourself from God, to um, commit actions that you feel like are so bad that you can't even pray, and you can't face another person, maybe the person that you've wronged, for instance. If you've done something like this, um, you know what Dimsdale's feeling. It's very moving when you see him be true to himself, to answer this call from God. The question I told you about in Genesis 3, where are you? I think that the end is the answer to this question of where are you? Here I am. This is who I am and where I am, and this is all I can offer. It's an offering I can give to the people of the New Jerusalem, and an offering I can give to God. Now, this is just probably the biggest absolute work of grace one could really see in a human. This is transforming, right? You see this man who was once one way, and then just completely shifts into another. This is the work of grace. And for Hawthorne, this is the sense in which God should be moving amongst those who call themselves American in this. Remember, I talked about exceptionality as this sense of exclusion. Perhaps, this sense of opening as opposed to foreclosing or closing oneself off. We should open ourselves up to others to show the truth about ourselves. Um, this, for me, seems to be Hawthorne's message, and something that I think we should get by the end of the book, because uh, you'll notice at the very end, and I'll end off here because I know I've been talking and rambling a bit, but I'll end off here. There's a very interesting connection at the very, very end of the story. And I know I've brought up the allegory of the cave probably more times than you want to hear it, but maybe it'll be helpful for you one day as it's been for me. Maybe not, but maybe you'll hear about it in a college class and you'll be like, oh, hey, Mr. Cruz talked about that. It says, it bore a device, um, a herald's wording of which may serve for a motto and a brief description of our now concluded legend, so somber is it, and relieved only by one ever-glowing point of light gloomier than the shadow. Now notice there's two things that come up that we've seen in Plato's allegory of the cave, which is the sense of light and the sense of shadow, and a sense of what's real and a sense of what's false. And we saw that come up in Frederick Douglass. And I'm hoping you guys can see this come up in Scarlet Letter. The sense in which light is really in reference to what reveals itself, what opens itself, what unveils itself before us. Think about it. If you were in a room, like our classroom, for instance, and there were no windows at all, and you turn off the light, your eyes would not adjust to the darkness immediately. You'd see nothing but darkness. Or like in a dark room, for instance, it's just darkness. You don't have any light. You can't see the thing that's in front of you. I've walked in rooms that were pretty dark, and I couldn't see in front of me, and I trip over things, or I step on my daughter's toys, or whatever. It's only when light kind of comes into that room that it begins to unveil, or things become apparent to me. They start to appear before me. And that in many ways is the work of education, but in other ways it's also the work of grace, right? The sense in which light coming into the darkness is a work of grace. For Dimsdale, this is the ultimate form of the allegory of the cave, where he is now revealed that the former life that I had, this life in which I had been hiding, is the cave, right? Like this, what was I so afraid of? What was I so scared of? And fear preys so much on our emotions. Moving back into the sense of the romantic, fear preys so much on our emotions in many ways, as humans who have these prohibitions on us. Well, what if I transgress this thing? What if I don't do this one thing? What's going to happen to me? And we're sort of schooled in this way. We're trained in this way to think societally about life in this way. But we never stop to think, like, what if this particular way is wrong? What if it's the wrong way of doing things? And don't just think about the things that you've heard in society that are wrong. Think about the things right now in the church. Think about the things right now in your life in CCA that are just wrong. Like, just not just that that you didn't like them, like, lanyards or whatever, but things that you would return to and maybe think are unethical, things that we do. And where can light break into that darkness and begin to transform you in the same way that Dimsdale was? All right, that's what I have for you guys. I hope that that was as satisfying an ending for you as it was for me. If not, forgive me, and if if you maybe didn't like the language of the Scarlet Letter, I can understand that, because it's somewhat old, I think. Although I think as we continue reading it, it gets a little easier for you to kind of process than the beginning. I promise that The Great Gatsby will be a lot easier to understand, because it's written in a more modern tongue. So the English will be a little bit easier. Although I still think very, very, a very deep book, something that is going to require a lot of analytical tools for us to get through. But the good thing is, at least it's quite short, so I don't think it'll be too challenging for us to get through in terms of being able to cross the terrain of The Great Gatsby. I'm hoping that also, and this I keep saying this, but this will be the last thing I say. I'm hoping also that you're able to get the continuity between all three of the main texts that we've read in this class, which is The Crucible being this, postmodern play about the Puritans, in which we get this other sense, this other kind of reveal going on. Um, it's about the Puritans, but it's not just about the Puritans. It's about us, right? Like the, the Crucible is really about how we treat one another, and how the ways in which we're able that we would put ourselves before other people. Frederick Douglass is a very similar novel in which we seek our own gain. Um, Not necessarily Frederick. I'm talking about the people who had enslaved Frederick and the people who um, would put themselves in a position of superiority over him, um, in which causes him to want to rebel, to seek a higher calling, this sense of education. We talked about that with the allegory of the cave. The sense of education that's beyond just freedom. It's not just freedom. Freedom from what? Once you're free, what do you do? We always talk about like being free from school, being free from my parents, and I used to be there too. Trust me, I was 16 and 17 years old. But when we talk about freedom, very often we don't think about what it means to actually be free. And when we get that freedom, we don't know what to do with it, um, which I think is a challenge for a lot of us. And moving on into the Scarlet Letter, this sense of freedom as a kind of truth, the truth that we reveal about ourselves, where we're at, right? Um, in the Great Gatsby, I think that the same themes that we've been talking about in American literature are going to be then brought into this next novel. And you'll see that this is a kind of continuing human and American story. Um, Whether or not we'll come to terms with who we are or come to terms with where we are in our development. All right, guys. Thanks so much for listening, and answer the questions when you finish.